Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whatever time you happen to be watching this. You have completed test number 3 in Business 211, Supervision and Team Building. So I welcome you here as Joe Lane, your online professor. Still sounds a little unusual, kind of getting used to doing these videos, but I'd much rather see you sitting in class, than talking to you this way. But it's been interesting, and I hope we both learned some things from doing this. You've taken test number 3, and now we have 3 chapters left, chapters 13, 14, 15, and a little bit of an appendix that we're going to look at towards the very back of the book. That's going to make up the test that we have to do for test number 4, or the final. So we're getting closer and closer to the final here. We've got chapters 13, 14, 15, and the appendix, and then we take the final, and we have finished Business 211 Supervision. Kind of get started with this. This particular chapter is a chapter on staffing. Okay, chapter 13, the title of the chapter is Staffing. Now, some texts might almost call this Human Resource Management. It's a chapter on human resource management, managing the most important asset that you have in your company, which are your employees. Okay. So let's look at, and I'll tell you what else I did. This was not in the chapter, but it was in your notes. When I think about human resource management, or I think about staffing, I think about this little, I guess you'd call it kind of a bar graph thing that I do. We're not going to be using it very specifically on a lot, but I think it just kind of lays out human resource management. Once you determine numbers, once you determine who or whom you have to hire, you have to go out and find those folks. You've got to get folks to apply. You have to find them. Once you find them, from the ones you have found, you have to select the 1 or 2 or whatever that you feel like is best for your company. Then after you've made that selection, you go through an official hiring process. You have to officially hire them into the company. Right after hiring comes training. Training has to begin as soon as a person comes on board and should remain the entire time that person is with the company. And then along with training, something else goes on, appraising or evaluation. So after you've hired a person, training should be a long-term commitment of that company to do for that employee. It's good for the employee because it increases their skills, and it's good for the company. The employee becomes more productive. And then periodically, at least annually, you have to appraise your employees or evaluate them. And you want to do all this stuff right because you want to hire really good people. And then you want to train them so that you can retain them. You don't want to lose good people. So you want to do this entire staffing process in such a way that once you've got these good folks and you've trained them, you can retain them. And the last thing I was going to mention, I kind of put it down here, and then we'll kind of actually get into the text, I guess, of the study notes. There's a lot of legal stuff. There's a lot of legal things with going out and finding and selecting and hiring and training and appraising and keeping your employees. There's a lot of rules, there's a lot of regulations, there's a lot of laws to make sure that we do these things right. Okay, so let's kind of with that get started. I'm looking at my handout. What is staffing? If you look at your study notes, I've defined that for you. And just like we did when we went through the last chapters, I'll tell you those things you need to know. I'll tell you those things you need to be familiar with. So I'd be familiar with what staffing is. It's the process through which employees are recruited, interviewed, selected, oriented for employment with that company. The process through which employees are recruited, interviewed, selected, and oriented. All right. So in the idea, what are we trying to do? We're trying to get good people in our company. So I'd be familiar with what staffing is. Now, the next thing you'll see on your handout, or if you have the book in your book, is the staffing process. What goes on with staffing? And we've listed those things for you here. the staffing process, analyzing and specifying. That really, if you were looking at my little graph here, analyzing and specifying, that really comes first before you start this. Because if you look at that, these, what are your needs, what are the jobs, this sort of thing. You need to do this first. Analyzing and specifying. Secondly, forecasting. The number of employees needed to achieve certain goals within the organization. Thirdly, recruiting. You have to go out and recruit. Interviewing, that's part of the selection process. Selecting, and then after you've hired, orienting. Orienting is a part of training. So I'd like for you to be familiar, I think I'd like for you to know the staffing process. Let's go back over it again and not be so maybe hodgepodge jumping around on it. The staffing process. First you have to analyze and specify what your needs are. You've got to forecast the number of employees needed to accomplish your goals. You've got to recruit, bringing in applicants for those jobs. You've got to interview as a part of trying to select. Then number 5 is selecting. You want the people that are the best fit for your company, that have the best skills, the best education. And then orienting. Once you've selected, you're not through. Orienting is the beginning of training. Now, one thing that I might mention here is probably I would know the staffing process. I'd also be familiar with this. When it comes to forecasting the number of employees needed to achieve goals, supervisors are very, very involved in forecasting. They probably won't be doing a lot with analyzing and specifying. They won't be doing the recruiting. HR will probably be doing the recruiting. Will they probably be involved in interviewing? They probably will. In selection, they better be. If I were a supervisor, I wouldn't want somebody to come into my department and say, hey, here's your new person. That's the first time I heard of them. So they'll be involved in selection. Will they be involved in training or orientation? Absolutely yes. So I'd just be familiar with probably, that the supervisor is involved in a lot of the staffing process. Certainly is involved in the forecasting of the numbers that are needed because it's their department. Now we talked about a lot of legal stuff here as it relates to staffing. Let's look at, I think I'll pull up my chair here. Let's look at some of the laws and things and kind of how they evolve or how they work as far as legal things within human resource management or within staffing. There's well, I didn't stay there long, did I? Okay, because I need to write a couple of things down here. Equal employment opportunity. There are 2 pieces of legislation, the Equal Employment Opportunity Act and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as amended, Title VII, that talks about equal employment opportunities. I have it on your handout. Here's what the Civil Rights Act and the Equal Employment Opportunity Act does. It makes discrimination illegal. Discrimination in the workplace is illegal. People need to have an equal opportunity for employment. If a person is male, or if a person is female, or if a person is black, or a person is white, or a person is married, or a person is single, or a person has children, a person are a Baptist, or they are Methodist, those sort of things are things that you should not determine your employment on. Those are discriminatory things. And so what the Civil Rights Act does, and Equal Opportunity Employment Act, they prohibit workplace discrimination. You cannot discriminate in the workplace. If you do, you're breaking federal law. So I'd be familiar with the fact I said a minute ago that a lot of this stuff within the human resource area, there's a lot of, the way he puts it here, I love the term. He says, staffing has evolved into a complex and litigious activity. So I'd be familiar that staffing has evolved into a complex and litigious legal activity. Okay. And also be familiar with the Equal Opportunity Employment Act and the Civil Rights Act have to do with discrimination in the workplace. It is not legal. Now there's another piece of legislation under Equal Employment Opportunity, if you're looking at your handout, the Vocational Rehabilitation Act. The Vocational Rehabilitation Act, I'd like for you to be familiar with that one as well. Vocational Rehabilitation Act, it provides protection. You cannot discriminate against a handicapped person because they're handicapped. A person is in a wheelchair. Well, I'm not going to think about hiring them because they're in a wheelchair. No, I don't think so. You know, even if a person has, and I mentioned here, Vocational Rehabilitation Act, handicaps are a protected class. It includes contagious disease. Didn't spell that out very well at the end, but you can see it, and I'd be familiar with it. Hepatitis A, hepatitis B, C, whatever it is, AIDS. People that have contagious diseases are protected under the Vocational Rehabilitation Act. You cannot discriminate against them because they have a contagious disease. Now, there may be certain jobs they can't do, but you can't say, nope, won't consider you because of that. All right, that's the Vocational Rehabilitation Act. Now, there's some things to do with compensation and benefits. Some acts there. Compensation and benefits. So I'll throw that. I probably should have already put these up, but maybe it helps somebody to write them down. There are some legislation, just like there's legislation here in the Vocational Rehabilitation Act, the Civil Rights Act, the EEOC, Equal Opportunity Employment Act, and we talked about what those did. And I wanted you to be familiar with those three pieces of legislation. The Fair Labor Standards Act under compensation and benefits. The Fair Labor Standards Act, another piece of federal legislation, it deals with two things, minimum wage and overtime. If you are a particular class of worker, you are entitled to a minimum wage, and you're entitled to overtime, which is over 40 hours a week. So I just want you to be familiar with the Fair Labor Standards Act. It deals with minimum wage and overtime for employees. Those are federal guarantees. The Equal Pay Act. This is one of the few federal pieces of legislation that is directly addressed to men and women. And basically it says if both people are doing the same job, they should be paid equally for that job, whether they're a man or whether they're a woman. Historically, women make somewhere around 75 to 80 cents on the dollar for what a man makes. I guess because women used to stay at home and they got into the workplace, it was just to support the man or whatever, way back. But today in 2020, and it's been this way for a long time, if a man or a woman does the same job, should they get equal pay for it? Well, of course. Of course. And that's what the Equal Pay Act does. But that's still not always the case. Now, let me give you an example. When I worked in the school business, elementary and secondary education, let's talk about principals, or let's talk about let's talk about teachers. Now, how did you base the pay of a teacher? In Louisiana, how do you base the pay of a teacher? Well, primarily it's based on education and years of experience. If you have a particular level of education, a bachelor's degree, a master's degree plus 30, a doctorate degree, that means that you're going to make a particular amount of money, and then the number of years that you have as far as in education is concerned. So if I've got a man here and that man is teaching, and I've got a woman here and that woman is teaching, and they're both teaching 5th grade at Boley Elementary School, could that man and that woman be making a different amount of money? The answer is yes. You say, wait a minute, I thought you said equal pay. But here's the deal. We base pay on degrees and years of experience. So let me clarify this. Here is a man with a master's degree and 10 years of experience. Here is a lady with a master's degree and 10 years of experience. Are they going to be making the same amount? Yes. Yes. Because they have the same qualifications. That depends upon their pay level and everything. Does that make sense? So that's way too much on that. But the Equal Pay Act, all the Equal Pay Act does, although it's very, very important, equal pay for equal work, men and women. ERISA, whoa, employee retirement and I'm off here for just a second. I cannot remember for the life of me. I'll be back. The Employee Retirement Income and Securities Act. It just wouldn't come to me. The Employee Income and it really won't come to me. The Employee Retirement Income and Securities Act. Okay, I'm not going to try to repeat it again. That's what it is. What that does is that protects an employee's pension and benefits. Let's say that you're working for just a medium-sized company and you have health insurance with that company. That company has a health insurance plan through somebody other that they offer to their employees. You may pay part of it, you may not. Let's say you come down with some serious heart disease, and there's a lot of money going. It's just going to have to be paid out by the by the insurance, and this could be an ongoing disability. Well, the employer there says, you know what? If I keep Joe Lane on the payroll, he's going to be a real medical expense. And my insurance company that I have providing medical coverage for my employees, they're going to go up on our premiums. So we better get rid of him. You can't do that. You can't do that. ERISA protects employees. They protects the employees' pensions, protects an employee's pensions and their benefits. So I'd be familiar with Fair Labor Standards Act, Equal Pay Act, and ERISA. Not going to try to tell you what it is. As far as the whole word, it protects pensions and benefits. Okay, let's look a little bit more. Oh gosh, there's some more. Employer relations. In companies, you have employees. And in companies, you have employers. You have employees, labor, employers, management. So there's some laws that were passed as it relates to employee-employer relationships. That's on my mind. It's on the back side of my handout. There's 3 big laws. I'm not going to write them up here on the board since I have them, and you have them in your study guide as well. I'd like for you to be familiar with these 3 laws. The Wagner Act. It gave employees the right to form and join unions. Huge, huge piece of legislation. The Taft-Hartley Act, the second one under this, was a piece of legislation that said if a state passes a piece of legislation that says that people working in this state do not have to join a union to go to work for a company. If they pass that kind of legislation, that was called a right to work state. And so what Taft-Hartley did, Taft-Hartley is kind of a piece of management legislation. Obviously the Wagner Act was a huge piece of employee legislation. But Taft-Hartley said this, hey look, if you as a state, if you want to pass legislation that says that if somebody wants to go to work in your state and that particular company they're going to work for has a union, you do not have to join that union if you don't want to. That's what Taft-Hartley did. And then the third piece of legislation on the employee-employer relations is something called the Landrum-Griffin Act. This one's always been kind of interesting to me. When unions came along, unions started growing really large. And sometimes the leaders of the union started getting kind of corrupt. They'd take the union dues that the union members were paying, and they'd use that for stuff they weren't supposed to do. They wouldn't allow union members to vote on things. They wouldn't allow them to see the finances. Now, this is not every union, but it was some unions. And so Landrum-Griffin was a piece of federal legislation passed to rid corruption in unions, get rid of corruption in unions. So these are 3 I'd like for you to be familiar with. the Wagner Act, the right to form and join unions, Taft-Hartley Act, the right for a state to pass a law saying you did not have to join the union if you went to work for a company. This is called right to work states, and Landrum Griffin cleaning up corrupt unions. Okay, so that's kind of some stuff about the legal things. Now let's talk a little bit about this process here that leads to hiring and a little bit further on. Interviewing. Oh, let me do this. I mean, we may have done this in another class, but let me do this. Tell me, before you interview, when you go out and find people, the first thing that a person does is they normally fill out an application. They fill out a paper application, they fill out one online, whatever. Tell me what these things on an application have in common, if I can do it. Okay, what do those things have in common on an application? Probably a lot of you have already said, so I'll answer you. Probably like you've answered. They can't be on there. They shouldn't be on there. Because these are things by which you discriminate. I'm not going to hire anybody if they're over a certain age. I don't want to hire any men. I don't want any people that are married. I don't want anybody that's not married. I don't want any people that have a bunch of kids. I don't want any Hispanics. I don't want any Caucasians. That's discrimination. And if you remember, I didn't write it in over here, Civil Rights Act of 1964 is amended, Title VII. You cannot discriminate in the workplace. And if you do, it's federally illegal. I've had some people say, no, wait a minute, I don't want to hire somebody that's too young or something. Okay, you can do something like this. Are you 18 years of age or older? That's okay. All right, anyway. I just want to throw that in because we're getting to something here. We're talking about interviewing. Okay, just as a thought here, you can't ask anything in an interview that you can't ask on an application. Just keep that in mind. Now, if a person walks in for an interview, you probably have a pretty good idea what sex they are. You probably have a fairly good idea what age they are. So you've got some clues there. But you still can't ask questions you couldn't ask on an interview. Are you married? Oh, you are. Have any children? Thinking about having any children anytime soon? You can't ask those kind of questions in an interview. What you're trying to do with an interview primarily is you're wanting to find out about that person's desires, what their aspirations are. You want to find out about their education. You want to find out about their experience and that sort of thing. Now, one thing I did list here in interviewing, ask questions. One of the things that you want to do when you interview is ask questions. One of the things that I always ask if I'm on an interview committee, the question that I will ask, each of the people when they come in for the interview, I'll say, where do you see yourself 5 to 10 years from now? If that person answers, laying up on the beach somewhere soaking in the sun, it's not a good answer. That may be what you want to do, but that's not going to help you get the job. A better answer would be, I'd like to be a part of your business and have the opportunity to come into your business and move up, that type of thing. Okay, so that's an open-ended type question. So questioning is really good. Just keep that in mind. However, I'll almost go off camera here. This is something that I just kind of mentioned a second ago. But he says, we talk about questions. The type of questions that should be asked in an interview about education, training, experience, skills, that sort of thing. He talked about some general interviewing guidelines. Ask open-ended questions. We talked about that. Now, questions to avoid in an interview. And I'd be familiar with some of these as well. I'll mention a few of them to you. I already have. What are some questions you should avoid in an interview? A person's race, a person's age, a person's gender, a person's religion, a person's marital status, whether they have children. You kind of get the idea. Just the sort of thing we talked about as it relates to applications. Okay. So, as far as being familiar with, I would be familiar with interviewing. You're trying to determine the most, just what it says here. Determine the real qualifications of people, of the people that you're looking to hire. Be sure that one of the techniques that you want to use is you want to ask open-ended type questions. But there are some questions, and this is be familiar with, that you want to avoid, those questions that are discriminatory. I put over here on the side about contacting references. A lot of times on a person's application, they'll list certain references. Is it okay for you to contact references? Well, sure. Now, time out. Just a little hint here, and I know you already know this, but sometimes we let it slip. If you want to utilize somebody as a reference, because you're trying to find a job, so you want to use Freddie Smith as a reference, what do you need to do before you use Freddie Smith as a reference? That's right. You need to ask their permission. Now, secondly, you ask Freddie Smith the permission to use that person as a reference. Okay, a couple of years go by, you're getting ready to change jobs, and you think, I want to use Freddie Smith again. Should you ask him? Yes, because it's been a good period of time. When people ask me on occasion, can I use you as a reference? If I choose to let them, I'll say yes, and then I'll say, send me some information about yourself. What's been going on since I've seen you last? That way, if I get contacted, I can do a better job as a reference because I know what you're doing, I know what you're doing currently. So anyway, here's something that I would be familiar with. One of the best questions to ask concerning references. What's a great question to ask if you to a reference that he's giving you? If that reference is someone that you have worked for previously, the question would be, is this applicant eligible for reemployment? Hey, if you've got a chance to reemploy Joe Lane, would you do it or not? That's a pretty good question. That's a pretty good question. So just keep in mind that one of the great questions to ask a reference, especially if that reference is you ever have worked for that reference, and a lot of times that's the kind of people you'll put on there, is this person eligible for reemployment with you and your company? All right. Testing. That's also a part of the selection process. Applications, interviews, those things are a part of the selection process leading up to hiring. Okay. Is it okay to give employment test? Well, their answer is sure, but that test should be related to the job. That test should be good performance on the test should relate to what would be expected, good performance on the job. Y'all know that I do a lot of running, that sort of thing. Well, let's say they're going to hire somebody else for the business department here at Delta. And I say, okay, one of the qualifications, one of the things that we want, and one of the tests I want to give them, I want them to go out and run a few miles with me. Because I want to have, a running buddy here at Delta. So one of the things we're going to do is I'm going to take them out and see if, and let them run with me. Okay, is being able to run a few miles necessarily going to make a person a good business and technology professor? The answer is no. So that would not be a valid test to give. Okay. Just remember that tests should be related to the job. Good performance on the test, good performance on the job. Now, I mentioned two words here I'd like for you to be familiar with: valid and reliable. Tests have to be valid and tests have to be reliable. What does that mean? Valid, they measure what they're designed to measure. If a test is supposed to measure your speed on a keyboard, then that test needs to measure your speed on the keyboard. So it's valid if it measures what it's supposed to measure. If it's valid every time you give it to someone, it's also reliable. So it needs to be valid and it needs to be reliable. Okay. I think you may hear a phone ringing or whatever. We'll catch that after we get through with chapter 13. Okay. So valid, it measures what it's supposed to be to measure. Reliable, it measures it each time. So be familiar with tests being valid and tests being reliable. Physical exams. Is it a good idea to give a physical? Yes. Yes, because you're going to do a drug screen in almost every type of job you have somebody come into. So a drug screen is a part of that physical. That person may have a back injury, have something like that. It doesn't mean you're not going to hire them, but you could document any pre-existing illnesses or things that they've had. Certainly do the drug screen and everything. So now, when do you give it? When do you give a physical? Oh, look, we went out to try to find some people, and 28 people have applied for this job. Have we got to do 28 physicals? Well, no, of course not. When do you do the physical? Right before the hire, as a part of the actual hire process itself. We are offering you this position at this amount of money, yada, 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 contingent on the passing of the physical. That's when you would give it. Okay. You're now hired. So I got to make sure that we understand, and I put it here, selection, hiring is not the last step. That's really just the beginning. It's really just the beginning. You go through this part to get them hired. And then that's the beginning, hopefully, of a long and productive career for that employee. And if you do things right, that can become a very invaluable employee that you can retain. Okay, so orientation, selection is not the last step. Orientation is usually the first training that you get. And if you look at my handout, there's organizational orientation. Usually HR will do that. You know, how much money you make, the overall policies and procedures and everything of the company. Then, since this is supervision, that employee is going to come to you for departmental orientation. So you need to know, what would you do? When that employee is supposed to come in on Monday morning at 8 o'clock, would you be available to meet that employee when they came in? Sure. I think so. I think you would. What would be the first thing you'd do with that employee? Probably welcome them, let them know where the bathrooms are, answer any questions that they may have right as they walk in the door, and then what? Introduce them to the other employees. You know, hey, this is our new person. Introduce them, and take a moment. Let them chat a little bit. That's okay. That's okay. The supervisor is absolutely key in getting the new employee off on the right foot by the way they handle their departmental orientation. Okay. So I would be familiar that a physical exam should be done for the person as a part of the actual hire process itself. I'd be familiar with the fact that selection is not the last step. After selection comes orientation and then the employment. And then there's something that I cut off at the bottom. I did not realize I did that. But at the very end of this chapter, on staffing, he talks about, after he gets through with kind of most of what we've been doing, interviewing, employee testing, what we've talked about, physical examinations is a good idea. Checking references, we talked about that. A little bit more about orient. Then at the very end of this chapter, he talks about staffing concerns. There really wasn't much in there that I wanted us to be familiar with, but there's one thing when it comes to discharge. If you're going to terminate a person, you should make sure that you have done what is called progressive discipline. Okay. Now I'm just kind of throwing this out here. This really is not kind of in the logical sequence of what we've talked about so far, but at the end he just said, hey, here's a few staffing concerns. And most of them, they're just a page or so, and most of them I didn't want to even, there wasn't any reason for us to discuss, I didn't think. But under termination of employees, he talks about the term progressive discipline. I'd like for you to be familiar with what that is. Let me show you. To discharge an employee, supervisors must first establish and document cause. If you're going to terminate somebody, you should have a reason, a valid, legitimate reason. That's what they're saying. Okay, good. Before determination of cause can be made, supervisors must have valid documentation and must have warned the employee about the unacceptable behavior and negative behavior. This is known as progressive discipline. Every step in the process should be fully documented. In other words, very seldom are you going to be, there's sometimes you can, but for the most part, very seldom can you just terminate somebody. You're fired. Now there could be, let's say that you have a policy that says that fighting on the job is a termination offense. So if you've got somebody that's fighting on the job, you can immediately fire them. But most of the time, to terminate somebody, you have to have done things prior to that. Did you have any counseling with them? Did you maybe give them a verbal warning? Did you give them a written warning? Was there a suspension? In other words, was there documentation? You documented all along the things that you tried to do to make sure that this employee would perform the way they were supposed to. And that's what progressive discipline is. Supervisors must have valid documentation and must have warned the employee about the unacceptable behavior and negative behavior. This is known as progressive discipline. So there's things that you should have done and documented prior to coming up with the termination. Okay, I just thought I'd like for you to be familiar with the term progressive discipline. I think that's it. I think that's our chapter on human resource management. Just remember this. Your employees, including you, are the most valuable assets that your company has. The company has trucks, the company has other things, but the employees are the most valuable things at all. You want to hire the right fit for your company. You want to hire good people, people that have the skills, the education, the training that you need. And then when you're hiring good people, you want to make them even more better, gooder. Well, okay, you know what I'm saying. By making sure that you start off with orientation and you train them, you appraise them in such a way that it helps improve their performance so that you can retain those employees. Because employees are the key to every organization. They're the most important asset you have. So, human resource management, from the time you go out and find folks until that person has stayed with you 30 or 40 years and retired, how you handle this is vitally important to how successful your company is going to be. Okay, I do think that takes care of chapter 13 on staffing. I'm going to take a little break here. I've got the hairstylist is going to have to redo my hair. Makeup's going to come in, touch up a little bit, do a few things like that. And then we're going to get into chapter 14. Chapter 14 is one of the shortest chapters in the book. So it's not going to take us long to go through chapter 14. So I'm not sure when you'll view chapter 14, I'll probably do it for you here in just a few minutes. Now the way we have to do this, in case you've forgotten, is I need to make a loud noise so that Professor Pierce, he's my executive producer here in the studio. Now he's not here. He just sets all this stuff up and I come in and film and that sort of thing. But then he comes and gets all the filming I've done and splices it and puts it in Canvas and everything. He's a pretty smart guy. But anyway, the way I'm supposed to do this is I'm supposed to make a loud noise, and that way he can see that and can tell that that's probably a break between chapters. So thank you for being with me in a chapter that I always enjoy, a chapter in human resource management. You can shout at the same time I clap if you want to, and we will close out chapter 13. See you in chapter 14.